My husband, the celebrated neurosurgeon, kissed the purple bruise on my throat that he created with his own thumbs less than 8 hours ago. And he didn't even blink. He admired his handiwork in the vanity mirror, adjusting his silk tie with the satisfaction of an artist finishing a masterpiece. I simply applied a thicker layer of beige concealer, blended the edges until the violence disappeared, and went downstairs to butter his morning toast. He believes my silence is submission, a permanent state of terrified obedience that he has cultivated over 10 years of marriage. He doesn't realize that silence isn't empty. It is full of answers. And today I finally found the one that will end him. You know, there is a specific kind of silence that exists only in the sterile hallways of a hospital at 3 a.m. A heavy and antiseptic quiet that smells of rubbing alcohol and unspoken prayers. And I have lived in that silence for a decade. Imagine being the person who holds the flashlight while someone else digs the grave. Except the grave is your own life, and the person digging it is the man everyone else calls a savior. I am Sarah, the invisible woman standing in the shadow of the great doctor, Marcus Thorne, the man with the golden hands and the soul of a butcher. But tonight the shadow is going to start moving on its own. People look at us and see the perfect American dream, the handsome doctor and his devoted nurse wife. But they don't see the tremors in his hands that only a cocktail of opioids can steady. Or the way I have to calculate every breath I take to avoid shattering his fragile ego. I have spent years protecting his reputation, hiding his addiction, and covering up the bruises on my own skin, sacrificing pieces of my soul to keep his pedestal from crumbling. But when the protector decides to become the executioner, the most terrifying thing isn't the violence. It is the absolute calm that comes before the needle pierces the skin. The morning light in our kitchen was aggressively bright, reflecting off the stainless steel appliances that cost more than my father's house. And it made the throbbing in my neck feel sharper, like a reminder of my place in this perfectly curated hell. Marcus sat at the head of the table, reading the Wall Street Journal with a focus that was entirely theatrical, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the granite countertop that I knew was a symptom of withdrawal creeping in. He looked up at me, his eyes glassy and rimmed with red, and pushed his empty coffee mug forward with the entitlement of a king, expecting his servant to anticipate his thirst before he even felt it. I poured the dark roast, watching the steam rise and curl around his face. And for a fleeting second, I imagined the scalding liquid splashing against his skin, peeling away that handsome mask to reveal the monster underneath. But I didn't pour it on him. I poured it into the cup, my hand steady and practiced. Because I am a professional. And professionals do not make messes. They clean them up. He took a sip, grimaced as if the temperature was a personal insult, and then muttered about the hospital board meeting, his voice scraping against the air like a rusty scalpel. The smell of his expensive cologne, a mix of sandalwood and arrogance, filled the room, trying to mask the faint, sour odor of the whiskey he had sweated out during the night. But I could smell it, just like I could smell the fear radiating off him. He was terrified of the gala tomorrow night, terrified that his shaking hands would betray him in front of the cameras. And he needed me to fix him, just like I always did. It wasn't the bruise on my neck that broke me, because pain is something you can learn to tolerate if you treat it like a clinical symptom. But it was the silence in the living room that finally severed the last thread of my loyalty. Buster, my 12-year-old golden retriever, wasn't there to greet me with his arthritis-stiff tail and his soft, cloudy eyes. And the empty space where his bed used to be felt like a physical hole in the floorboards. Last night, in a rage fueled by a missed vein and a bad day at the clinic, Marcus had kicked him because Buster's barking was interrupting his concentration. And when the old dog didn't get up, Marcus had simply told me to deal with the mess before he went to bed. I had spent the darkest hours of the night wrapping my only friend in a blanket, digging a hole in the frozen earth of the backyard, while my husband slept the sleep of the medicated righteous. And I think a part of my humanity went into the ground with that dog. I looked at the spot on the rug where Buster used to sleep. And I didn't cry. Because tears are for people who have hope. And I had traded hope for something much colder and much more useful. Marcus finished his toast, wiped crumbs from his mouth with a linen napkin, and stood up, completely oblivious to the vacuum of grief he had created in this house. Or perhaps he just didn't care, because in his world, only his pain mattered. He checked his watch, a heavy gold Rolex that felt like a shackle on his wrist, and told me he would be late tonight, which meant I had exactly 12 hours to prepare the cocktail that would strip him of everything he loved. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my scrub pants, a sharp vibration against my thigh that made me flinch, and I pulled it out to see a message from him, sent from the car before he had even left the driveway. Double the dose tonight. The text read, followed by no emoji. No, please. Just the raw command of an addict who sees his wife as nothing more than a dispensary with legs. He needed the opioids to sleep, to stop the tremors, to drown out the voice in his head that told him he was a fraud. And he needed me to administer them because his own hands were too shaky to find the vein without leaving a track mark. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the delete button, and I felt a strange sense of power surging through my veins. A cold electricity that replaced the fear I had lived with for so long. For years, I had been the gatekeeper of his secrets, the one who balanced the chemistry of his blood so he could play God in the operating room. But a gatekeeper also holds the keys to the destruction. I walked to the high-security cabinet in the pantry, the one hidden behind a row of organic pasta sauces, and punched in the code that only the two of us knew. The lock clicked open with a satisfying sound, revealing rows of amber vials and sterile syringes, a pharmacy of controlled substances that could put a horse to sleep or wake the dead. I reached past the fentanyl, past the morphine that he craved with every cell in his body, and my fingers brushed against a bottle of haloperidol, a powerful antipsychotic that I had stolen from the psych ward months ago. The internal struggle was not about whether I should hurt him, but about how to do it in a way that would leave him alive enough to suffer, because death would be a mercy he did not deserve. I held the syringe up to the light, watching the dust motes dance in the beam. And for a moment, a dark and intrusive thought whispered that I could just inject a bubble of air into his jugular and call it an embolism. It would be quick. It would be untraceable. And I would be the grieving widow in black, weeping on the news about the tragedy of a brilliant mind gone too soon. But then I remembered the way he looked at me when he kicked Buster, the sneer of absolute contempt, and I realized that ending him quickly would be letting him win, because he would never know who defeated him. He needed to lose his mind before he lost his life. He needed to feel his own body betray him the way he had betrayed me. And he needed to know that I was the one pulling the strings. I set the haloperidol on the counter next to a vial of saline solution, and I began the delicate process of dilution, my hands steady as a surgeon's, mixing a precise recipe of chaos that would mimic a neurological breakdown. I wasn't just mixing drugs. I was mixing a new reality for Dr. Marcus Thorne, one where the walls would melt and the floor would tilt, and his precious golden hands would turn into useless claws. The liquid in the syringe was clear and innocent, looking exactly like the relief he was expecting. But inside that plastic barrel was a nightmare waiting to be injected. I capped the needle and placed it on the silver tray we used for his evening ritual, arranging the alcohol swabs and the tourniquet with the precision of a church deacon setting the altar for communion. The house was silent, but it was no longer the silence of the grave. It was the silence of a held breath. The heavy pause before the conductor raises his baton and the symphony begins. I walked into the living room and sat in his leather armchair, the one I was never allowed to sit in, and I traced the cracks in the leather with my fingertips, feeling the ghost of his presence. Tonight, when he came home, he would expect the usual routine: the submissive wife, the warm towel, the sharp prick of the needle, and the drift into oblivion. He would not see the hatred in my eyes because he never really looked at me. He only looked at his reflection in my obedience. I closed my eyes and rehearsed the scene in my mind, visualizing the exact angle of the needle, the speed of the plunger, and the lie I would whisper in his ear as the drug entered his bloodstream. "This will help you rest," I would say, and it would be the truth. Because after tonight, his career, his ego, and his cruelty would be put to rest forever. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the hour, a deep and mournful sound that signaled the beginning of the end, and I smiled into the empty room, waiting for the sound of his car in the driveway. The heavy rumble of the garage door opening vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet, a low mechanical growl that signaled the return of the master to his castle, and I remained seated in his leather chair, my heart rate maintaining a steady, clinical rhythm that would have impressed any cardiologist. I heard the heavy thud of his briefcase hitting the mudroom floor, followed by the sound of him kicking off his Italian loafers with a force that suggested he was already in the early stages of withdrawal irritability. Marcus walked into the living room, loosening his tie with a frantic, jerky motion, his face pale and slick with a sheen of cold sweat that stood out against the dim lighting I had carefully arranged. He didn't ask about my day. He didn't ask about the empty space where the dog's bed used to be. He simply looked at the silver tray on the side table, his eyes locking onto the prepared syringe with the desperate hunger of a starving wolf spotting a lamb. "Is it ready?" he rasped, his voice tight and breathless, and I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my skirt with deliberate calm, assuming the posture of the dutiful nurse he expected me to be. "It's ready, Marcus," I said softly, my voice devoid of the malice that was currently flooding my veins, and I gestured for him to sit on the sofa, guiding him down as if he were an invalid. He sank into the cushions, rolling up his sleeve to reveal the track marks that marred the inside of his elbow, a secret roadmap of addiction that only I was allowed to navigate. I tied the rubber tourniquet around his bicep, pulling it tight until the vein popped up, angry and blue, and I swabbed the skin with alcohol, the sharp, sterile scent filling the air between us like a barrier. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the relief he thought was coming, and I uncapped the needle, pausing for a fraction of a second to savor the weight of the plastic barrel in my hand. This wasn't just medicine. It was a sentence. And as I slid the needle into his vein and depressed the plunger, I wasn't healing him. I was rewriting his chemistry. The liquid disappeared into his bloodstream, and almost instantly, Marcus let out a long, shuddering sigh, his head falling back against the sofa cushions as his body went limp, surrendering to a peace that was entirely psychological. It was fascinating to watch the power of the mind, how the mere expectation of opioids could trick the brain into releasing its own dopamine, creating a phantom high that washed over him before the haloperidol could even begin to bind to his receptors. He smiled, a slack, lopsided expression of gratitude that made my stomach turn, and he reached out to pat my hand, his fingers clammy and weak. "You're the only one who understands, Sarah," he mumbled, his speech already beginning to slur slightly, not from the drug, but from the exhaustion he had been holding back all day. I stroked his forehead, my touch light and clinical, feeling the rapid pulse in his temples slowly decelerating as he drifted into the false security I had constructed for him. I looked at him, really looked at him, stripping away the titles and the accolades, and I saw him not as a husband, but as a biological specimen, a collection of nerves and impulses that I was now controlling. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and his deepening breaths. But inside my head, there was a roar of triumph. He thought I was his savior, the keeper of his secrets. But he didn't realize that the hand soothing his brow was the same hand that had just introduced a chaotic agent into his meticulously ordered system. I stayed there for a long time, watching the rise and fall of his chest, waiting for the placebo effect to wear off and the real chemistry to take hold, treating the moment with the reverence of a scientist waiting for a reaction in a petri dish. I remembered a time, years ago, when we were both exhausted residents surviving on vending machine coffee and shared dreams. And he had failed his board certification practice exam. He had collapsed into my arms that night, weeping with the raw, unfiltered vulnerability of a boy who was terrified he wasn't good enough. And I had held him, promising him that we would conquer the world together. Back then, his need for me felt like love, a mutual exchange of support where we carried each other's burdens. But somewhere along the line, the dynamic had shifted, and his need became a parasitic hunger that drained me dry to feed his ego. Looking at him now, passed out on the expensive leather sofa that he prioritized over our comfort, I realized that the boy I loved hadn't just grown up. He had metastasized into something malignant. He shifted in his sleep, his brow furrowing as the haloperidol began to cross the blood-brain barrier, disrupting the dopamine pathways that regulated his mood and motor functions. The drug wasn't designed to put him to sleep. It was designed to dampen his perceptions, to create a wall between him and reality. And even in his unconscious state, his body was starting to register the intrusion. His hand twitched, a sharp, involuntary spasm that knocked his phone off the cushion and onto the floor with a clatter. But he didn't wake up. I didn't pick up the phone. I just watched his fingers curl into a claw, a physical manifestation of the tension that the drug was inducing rather than relieving. This was the intimate betrayal I had chosen, not a violent blow, but a corruption of the care he felt entitled to, turning his sanctuary into a trap. Around midnight, the atmosphere in the room shifted from peaceful to oppressive, the shadows in the corners seeming to stretch and twist as if responding to the chaos unfolding inside Marcus's mind. He began to mutter, unintelligible fragments of words that sounded wet and heavy, his eyes moving rapidly beneath his lids as he entered a state of REM sleep that was anything but restorative. I turned off the main lights, leaving only a small reading lamp on the desk, creating a pool of yellow light that cast long, distorted shadows across his face, making him look gaunt and skeletal. He wasn't dreaming of fields of poppies. The haloperidol was likely dragging him through a gray, disjointed landscape of suppressed anxieties. And his body was reacting with mild dystonia. His neck muscles tightened, pulling his head to the side in an awkward angle. And he let out a whimper that sounded pathetic, coming from a man who commanded operating rooms with an iron fist. I walked over to the desk and pulled out a small, black moleskin notebook, the kind I used to use for grocery lists. And I opened it to the first fresh page. With a calm, steady hand, I wrote the date and the time, followed by a clinical description of his symptoms. Subject exhibits early signs of extrapyramidal reaction. Slight muscular rigidity observed in the cervical region. Verbalizations incoherent. Writing it down made it real. It transformed my revenge into a documented case study, distancing me from the emotional weight of what I was doing. I was no longer the victim. I was the observer, the narrator of his downfall. And the ink on the page felt like a binding contract. He woke up with a gasp at 3:00 a.m., sitting bolt upright as if he had been shocked with a defibrillator, his eyes wide and unseeing in the semi-darkness. He looked around the room frantically, his breathing shallow and rapid. And when his gaze finally landed on me sitting in the corner, he didn't seem to recognize me for a terrifying second. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling, lacking its usual authoritarian timbre. And I saw a flash of genuine terror in his eyes that was more satisfying than any apology he could have offered. "It's just me, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice low and soothing, effectively gaslighting him into doubting his own senses. "You were having a nightmare. Go back to sleep." He rubbed his face with his hands, but his coordination was off. His movements were jerky and imprecise, and he missed his own mouth when he tried to wipe away the saliva. "I feel heavy," he complained, looking at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "My arms feel like lead." "What did you give me?" The question hung in the air, charged with a sudden, sharp suspicion that threatened to derail everything. I didn't flinch. I stood up, walked over to him, and poured a glass of water, handing it to him with a steady hand. "Just the usual." "Darling," I lied, my face a mask of concern. "You're just exhausted. The stress of the gala is getting to you. Your body is telling you to rest." He took the glass, his hand shaking so badly that water sloshed over the rim and onto his shirt, and he stared at the wet spot with disproportionate distress. He drank greedily, desperate to wash away the metallic taste in his mouth, and then slumped back, too weak to argue, too drugged to analyze the lie. The morning sun hit the windows with the brutality of an interrogation lamp, exposing the sleepless night etched into the lines of Marcus's face as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands. He was trying to hold a spoon to eat his oatmeal, but a fine, persistent tremor had taken residence in his fingers, a rhythmic shaking that was the direct result of the dopamine blockade I had initiated. He slammed the spoon down, splattering oatmeal onto the pristine granite, and roared. "This is your fault. You messed up the dosage." I stood by the sink, washing dishes that were already clean, and I turned to him with wide, innocent eyes, summoning every ounce of acting ability I possessed. "Marcus, I gave you exactly what you asked for," I said, my voice trembling with feigned hurt. Maybe it's tolerance, or maybe it's the anxiety about the award. I planted the seed of doubt carefully, nurturing his own narcissism to cover my tracks. He looked at his hands again, terror warring with rage in his eyes. He needed those hands to be steady. They were his identity, his currency, his godhood. "I can't go up there like this," he whispered, the reality of the impending gala crashing down on him. I dried my hands on a towel and walked over to him, wrapping my arms around his shoulders from behind, leaning down to whisper into his ear like a serpent in the garden. "Don't worry," I said, looking at the tremor in his hand with a cold, predatory smile that he couldn't see. "I'll fix it. I have a stronger cocktail for tonight. You'll be perfect." He leaned back into me, accepting the comfort of his executioner, completely unaware that I wasn't planning to cure the tremor. I was planning to amplify it into a symphony of destruction. The walk-in closet was a mausoleum of Italian wool and starched cotton, smelling faintly of cedar and the stale, metallic scent of Marcus's lingering anxiety. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, a man trying to assemble himself into a deity. But the pieces were no longer fitting together as seamlessly as they once had. I watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame with my arms crossed, observing the way his fingers fumbled with the buttons of his shirt, the tremor in his hands now undeniable, a rhythmic twitch that turned a simple act of dressing into a humiliating ordeal. He cursed under his breath, a sharp, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate against the glass of the mirror, and then he turned to me, his eyes wild and accusing. "Help me," he snapped. Not a request, but a demand. The plea of a tyrant who had forgotten how to ask. I stepped forward, my movements fluid and practiced, and I began to button his shirt, my fingers brushing against the cold, clammy skin of his chest. He didn't thank me. Instead, he reached for the object lying on the velvet ottoman. The one thing that had always been the symbol of his power and my subjugation, his stethoscope. It wasn't the sleek, digital model he used at the hospital now. It was the old Littman classic we had bought together on graduation day. The black tubing worn smooth by years of use. The steel chesspiece scratched but still shining. He draped it around my neck, pulling me close by the tubing until our foreheads were almost touching, using the instrument of healing as a leash to assert his dominance. "Listen," he whispered, placing the diaphragm over his own heart, forcing me to hear the erratic, thundering rhythm of his fear. "That is the sound of a man carrying the weight of the world. Sarah, don't you ever forget who keeps the lights on in this house." The weight of the stethoscope around my neck was a physical anchor, dragging me down into the murky depths of a memory I had tried to drown in whiskey and denial. I looked down at the metal binaurals and saw the engraving. Faint but legible M, T, and S, T. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. It was the oath we had both taken, the promise that had once made my heart swell with pride when I looked at him. Back when his ambition was a fire that warmed us both, rather than an inferno that consumed everything in its path. But that oath had been broken 2 years ago in a sterile operating room, shattered alongside the spine of a young girl he had paralyzed because he was too hungover to keep his hands steady. I remembered the way he had come home that night. Not with remorse, but with a plan. A legal document he had drafted for me to sign, claiming I was the one who had mislabeled the anesthesia, forcing me to take the fall to save his God-given talent. I had signed it because I loved him. Or perhaps because I was already so hollowed out by his abuse that I didn't think my reputation mattered anymore. Now, the cool metal against my skin didn't feel like a badge of honor. It felt like a cold, iron shackle. A reminder that my career was dead, so his could continue to mimic life. I pulled the stethoscope from my ears. The sound of his racing heart abruptly cut off, replaced by the heavy silence of the room. I never forget. "Marcus," I said, my voice soft and devoid of the venom that was pooling in my stomach. "You are the heart of this family," he smirked, mistaking my submission for admiration, and turned back to the mirror to adjust his tie, unaware that the heart he was so proud of was being slowly poisoned by the very hands that had just buttoned his shirt. He tried to fix his cufflinks, the gold ones shaped like the staff of Hermes. But the haloperidol was working its dark magic, disrupting the fine motor signals between his brain and his fingers. His hand jerked violently, sending one of the cufflinks skittering across the hardwood floor like a terrified beetle. And the sound of it hitting the baseboard was the spark that ignited the powder keg of his frustration. "God damn it," he roared, his face turning a blotchy, ugly red, and he swept his arm across the dresser, sending a porcelain tray of colognes and watches crashing to the floor. The sound was deafening, a symphony of destruction that echoed through the house. But I didn't flinch. I had been trained by years of his outbursts to remain as still as a statue. A shard of the shattered porcelain tray flew up and sliced across my shin. A clean, sharp line of pain that blossomed into a warm trickle of blood, soaking into my stockings. Marcus didn't even notice. He was too busy staring at his own hands, holding them up to the light as if they were traitors he wanted to execute. "Look at this," he screamed, thrusting his trembling fingers in my face. "How am I supposed to operate? How am I supposed to shake hands with the board of directors tonight? You did this. You're stressing me out with your incompetence." The accusation was absurd, a delusion born of narcissism. But I nodded as if his logic were sound, accepting the blame because it was the fuel that kept his fire burning. And I needed that fire to blind him to the truth. I looked down at the blood dripping onto the expensive Persian rug, a bright, crimson contrast to the muted beige tones of the room. And time seemed to slow down. the seconds stretching into hours. In the past, this would have been the moment I cried, the moment I rushed to clean up the mess while apologizing for existing. But today, the pain felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. I was no longer the participant in this tragedy. I was the director. And this blood was just a prop, a necessary sacrifice to sell the scene. I calmly stepped over the broken glass, ignoring the sting in my leg, and walked to the bathroom, returning with a damp towel, not for myself, but for him. I wiped the sweat from his forehead, my touch gentle and maternal, effectively infantilizing him in his moment of rage. Shh, I soothed, treating him like a tantrum-throwing toddler. It's just nerves. Marcus, you're the best. Everyone knows you're the best. But you need to calm down, or you'll make it worse. He leaned into my touch, desperate for reassurance, his breathing hitching like a child's after a crying fit. He was pathetic. A hollow shell of a man, held together by drugs and my validation. And for the first time, I felt a surge of genuine pity, not the warm pity of compassion, but the cold, distant pity one feels for a dying insect. I can't go to the hospital like this, he whispered, his voice trembling. They'll see. They'll know. I have a solution, I said, guiding him toward the leather armchair in the corner of the bedroom, away from the broken glass. I'll make you a special smoothie, a muscle relaxant blend. It will stop the tremors long enough for you to get through the morning rounds. And then you can rest in your office until the gala. He looked at me with suspicion, his paranoia always simmering just below the surface. But his desperation was stronger. What's in it? He asked. Valerian root, magnesium, and a little something from your private stash to take the edge off. I lied. My face, the picture of innocent helpfulness. You trust me, don't you? Marcus, I'm the only one who knows how to fix you. He nodded slowly, defeated by his own body, and sank into the chair, closing his eyes. I went downstairs to the kitchen, the silence of the house wrapping around me, and I prepared the drink. I threw in kale and blueberries to mask the color, and then I crushed 2 pills of baclofen, a strong muscle relaxant, and emptied another capsule of the diluted haloperidol into the blender. The machine whirred to life, a loud, mechanical scream that drowned out the memory of Buster's last yelp, and I watched the green sludge swirl. A toxic potion brewed in a designer kitchen. This wasn't just a drink, it was a silencer, a way to render him pliable and unconscious so I could execute the next phase of the plan. I brought the glass up to him, and he drank it in 3 large gulps, the green liquid staining his lips. And within 20 minutes, his head lulled forward, his chin resting on his chest, his breathing deepening into a heavy, chemically induced stupor. He was out. The great doctor was nothing more than a drooling mess in a suit. This was the moment of the twist, the shift in power that he would never see coming. I knelt beside him, not to check his vitals, but to reach into the inner pocket of his jacket. My fingers closed around the cold, smooth metal of his smartphone, the vault that held his life, his affairs, and his cruelty. I held the phone up to his sleeping face, positioning it in front of his closed eyes, and then I gently, almost lovingly, used my thumb to pry open his right eyelid. The biometric sensor scanned his iris, a red light flashing briefly, and then the phone unlocked with a cheerful chirp that sounded obscenely bright in the gloomy room. I was in. I scrolled through his messages, finding the thread with me a long, one-sided history of abuse, threats, and demands for drugs. If you don't have the dose ready, don't bother being there. Useless bitch. Remember who owns you. I selected them all, one by one, and hit delete. Gone. erased from digital history. But I didn't stop there. I began to type, sending messages from his phone to mine, timestamping them for the hours he had been asleep or working late. I love you so much, Sarah. Thank you for taking care of me. I don't know what I'd do without you. I'm so nervous about the award. I feel like I'm losing my mind. But you're my rock. I created a narrative of a loving, fragile genius relying on his saintly wife. A digital paper trail that would contradict any accusation he might make later. Then, I opened his encrypted folder, the one he thought I didn't know the password to. It was his own birthday. Of course, and found the photos. Photos of the bruises he had left on me, which he kept like trophies. I forwarded them to a hidden cloud account only I could access, and then deleted them from his device. I placed the phone back in his pocket, patting the fabric smooth. I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror. Seeing the blood drying on my leg and the stethoscope still hanging around my neck, I looked like a warrior who had just won a silent battle. I took the stethoscope off and placed it gently in his lap, curling his limp fingers around it. First, do no harm, I whispered to his unconscious form. But you started this war. Marcus, I'm just finishing it. I walked out of the room, leaving him to sleep with the evidence of his demise resting in his pocket, ticking away like a time bomb set to explode the moment he woke up. The silence of the house was broken not by a scream, but by the wet, ragged sound of a man gasping for air as if he were drowning in his own sheets. Marcus woke up around 2 p.m, his body jerking violently on the leather armchair where I had left him. The expensive Italian wool of his suit, now dark with patches of sour, cold sweat. I was sitting across from him, reading a magazine about interior design, pretending to care about the color trends of the upcoming season. But my entire being was tuned to the frequency of his suffering. The muscle relaxants I had given him were wearing off, peeling away the artificial layer of calm to reveal the jagged, raw nerve endings of a full-blown opioid withdrawal underneath. He tried to sit up, but his limbs flailed uselessly, his coordination shattered by the chemical imbalance I had orchestrated, and he knocked the empty smoothie glass onto the floor. It didn't break. It just rolled across the hardwood with a hollow, mocking sound that seemed to echo the emptiness inside him. Sarah, he croaked, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel, and he clawed at his throat as if trying to rip out the thirst that was burning him from the inside out. I slowly lowered the magazine, marking my page with a deliberate slowness that I knew would infuriate him, and looked at him with the detached curiosity of a biologist observing a specimen under a microscope. I'm here, darling, I said, my voice soft and steady, a stark contrast to his frantic panting. You've been asleep for hours. You missed morning rounds. The mention of work acted like a defibrillator, shocking him into a panic that his weakened heart couldn't handle, and he clutched his chest, his eyes bulging with the terror of a narcissist losing his audience. He scrambled for his pockets, his trembling fingers fumbling for the phone I had planted back on him, desperate to check the damage to his reputation. I watched him unlock the screen, his eyes darting frantically over the notifications, and for a moment, confusion washed over his face as he read the loving texts I had sent to myself from his device. He couldn't reconcile the monster he was with the devoted husband the screen said he was, and in his drug-addled state, he chose to believe the screen because it was the reality he preferred. I don't remember sending these, he muttered, wiping a line of drool from his chin with the back of his hand, his skin looking gray and pasty in the afternoon light. You were very sweet last night, Marcus. I lied, standing up and walking over to him, looming over his seated form like a benevolent shadow. You said you wanted to change. You said you were tired of the anger. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for validation, desperate to believe that he wasn't losing his mind. But then the physical pain hit him again. A wave of cramps that made him double over. Withdrawal is a beast that eats you from the bones outward. It turns your blood into ice water and your skin into a prison of crawling insects. He groaned. A low, animalistic sound of misery, and grabbed my wrist. His grip weak and clammy. I need it. Sarah, he whispered. The facade of the great doctor completely stripping away to reveal the desperate junkie beneath. I need the kit. Now. My bones. They feel like they're breaking. I looked down at his hand on my wrist, remembering how strong that grip used to be when he was hurting me, and I felt a surge of cold. Righteous power. We're out. Marcus, I said, delivering the lie with the same clinical detachment he used when giving a terminal diagnosis. You used the last vial yesterday. Remember, you were so stressed about the dog. I brought up the memory of Buster deliberately, using it as a psychological weapon to spike his guilt and confusion. His face twisted in denial, his brain scrambling to find a loophole, a secret stash. Anything to stop the agony that was chewing on his nerve endings. No, he whimpered, shaking his head, sweat flying from his hair. I always keep a reserve. In the safe? Check the safe. He tried to stand up, to push past me. But his legs were like jelly, the muscles atrophied by the relaxants and the exhaustion. He stumbled, catching himself on the arm of the chair, and fell to his knees, panting heavily. It was a pathetic sight. The man who played God in the operating room now crawling on his own expensive rug, defeated by his own biology. I checked the safe. Marcus, I said, crouching down to his level, not to help him up, but to make sure he heard me clearly. It's empty. You took everything. You have a problem, and it's eating you alive. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and the panic in his eyes shifted from confusion to primal survival instinct. He needed a fix, and if he couldn't get it at home, he would go to the source. The hospital? He gasped, trying to claw his way up the side of the chair, his fingernails scratching against the leather. I have to go to the hospital. Pharmacy. Access codes. I can get it. He was delirious, thinking he could walk into his workplace in this condition, soaked in sweat, smelling of fear, shaking like a leaf, and steal narcotics without anyone noticing. It was the delusion of an addict who thinks he is invisible. You can't drive. Marcus, I said, standing up and taking a step back, blocking his path to the door not with force, but with logic. Look at your hands. You can't even hold a steering wheel. You'll kill someone before you get out of the driveway. He looked at his hands, which were vibrating violently, the tremors so bad that his fingers were blurring. He let out a scream of frustration, a raw, ugly sound that tore through the quiet house and through a heavy crystal coaster at the wall. It shattered, but the violence was impotent. A final burst of energy before the collapse. He wasn't dangerous anymore. He was just broken. He slumped against the side of the armchair, pulling his knees to his chest, shivering uncontrollably as the chills of withdrawal racked his body. He began to weep, not the dignified, silent tears of a martyr, but the loud, snot-nosed sobbing of a child who has been denied candy. It hurts, he wailed, rocking back and forth. Sarah, please, do something. Call a courier. Call someone. I can't do the gala like this. I watched him cry, remembering all the times I had cried in this very room while he watched television. Ignoring my pain, I felt a strange, hollow space in my chest where sympathy used to be, now filled with the cold clockwork of my plan. I can't call anyone. Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Think about your reputation. If anyone sees you like this, the doctor of the year, a weeping junkie, your career is over. The board will revoke your license by morning. I boxed him in, using his own vanity as the bars of his cage. He looked up at me, terror in his eyes at the thought of losing his status, which he valued more than his life. Then what do? He begged, reaching out for me, his hand grasping the hem of my skirt. Help me. Sarah, you always fix it. I looked down at him, this broken man clutching my clothes, and I smiled. A small, sad smile that he interpreted as mercy, but was actually the seal of his doom. I reached out and stroked his damp hair, ignoring the revulsion I felt at his touch. I do have one way, I whispered, leaning in close so he could smell the lavender soap on my skin, a scent of cleanliness that contrasted with his filth. I found one last vial, a hidden emergency dose, but it's potent. Marcus, very potent. His eyes lit up with a terrifying hope, the hunger returning instantly. Give it to me, he hissed, trying to pull himself up. Now. Give it to me now. I gently pushed him back down, asserting my control. Not yet, I said firmly, like a mother disciplining a greedy child. If you take it now, it will wear off before the ceremony, and you'll crash on stage. We have to wait. You have to endure this pain until tonight. He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I can't wait. It hurts too much. You have to, I commanded, my voice hardening just enough to cut through his hysteria. I will prepare a warm bath. I will shave you. I will dress you. And right before we leave, when you are standing at the door looking like the hero everyone thinks you are, I will give you the injection. It will be the best high you've ever felt. Marcus, it will make you fly. I sold him the fantasy, the promise of ultimate relief, dangling the carrot to keep him docile. He looked at me, searching for any sign of deception, but he was too desperate to see anything but what he wanted. He nodded slowly, collapsing back onto the floor, surrendering completely to my timeline. Okay, he whispered, closing his eyes as another wave of shivers hit him. Okay. Tonight? Promise me. I stood up and walked toward the bathroom to start the water, the sound of the faucet filling the silence. I promise, I said to the empty hallway. Tonight, you won't feel a thing. The trap was set. The bait was taken. And now all I had to do was wash the victim for the slaughter. The master bathroom was filled with steam, a thick, suffocating white fog that smelled of lavender bath salts and the metallic tang of impending illness, creating a humidity that made the wallpaper peel at the seams like dead skin. Marcus sat in the clawfoot tub, his knees drawn up to his chest, the water sloshing gently against the porcelain as he shivered violently, the ripples spreading out from his trembling body like shock waves from an epicenter of misery. I knelt on the cold tile floor beside him, my knees aching slightly from the hard surface, and dipped a sea sponge into the scalding water, squeezing it over his back with the solemnity of a mortician preparing a body for a wake. He didn't look like the neurosurgeon who commanded respect from an entire hospital staff. He looked like a plucked bird, his skin pale and goose-fleshed, his spine protruding sharply against the wet ceramic. It's too hot, he whined, his teeth chattering. But he didn't move away from the heat because the cold inside his bones was far more terrifying than the temperature of the water. It needs to be hot. Marcus, I whispered, scrubbing the sweat of withdrawal from his shoulders with slow, circular motions. We have to sweat out the toxins. We have to make you clean for your big night. He leaned his head back against the rim of the tub, closing his eyes, and allowed me to wash him, surrendering his bodily autonomy to me completely. I traced the line of his collarbone with the sponge, thinking about how easy it would be to press down, to hold him under until the bubbles stopped rising. But that would be too quick, too merciful. The water turned slightly gray with the grime of his suffering, and I rinsed the sponge, watching the dirty water swirl down the drain, taking his dignity with it. After the bath, I wrapped him in a heavy Egyptian cotton robe, drying him off with vigorous rubs that were meant to stimulate his circulation, but only seemed to highlight his frailty. He sat on the closed toilet lid, his head drooping, while I prepared the shaving kit, mixing the cream in the ceramic bowl until it formed a thick, stiff lather. I applied the foam to his face, covering the gray stubble that had sprouted during his day of delirium, masking his expression until he was just a blank canvas waiting for my knife. I picked up the straight razor, the handle heavy and cold in my hand, and tested the edge against my thumb. A small, intimate threat that went unnoticed by him. "Lift your chin," I commanded softly, and he obeyed instantly, exposing the vulnerable, pale expanse of his throat to the blade. I began to shave him, the razor scraping against his skin with a sound like tearing silk, removing the hair and the foam in long, precise strokes. My hand was steady, hovering millimeters above his jugular vein, and I could see the pulse fluttering there, a frantic, bird-like rhythm that betrayed his terror. He held his breath, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, trusting me with his life not because he loved me, but because he had no other choice. I wiped the blade on a towel, leaving a streak of white foam and dark hair, and leaned in close to his ear. "Don't move," I whispered, bringing the blade to his upper lip. "One slip, and you'll ruin your shirt before you even put it on." He squeezed his eyes shut, a tear leaking out and cutting a track through the remaining shaving cream. And I felt a surge of absolute control. I was the barber, the surgeon, the executioner, and he was just the meat in the chair. Dressing him was a chore, a physical struggle to force his limp, uncooperative limbs into the rigid structure of formal wear. Like trying to stuff a scarecrow into a suit of armor, I had to guide his arms into the starched white shirt, buttoning the cuffs while his hands shook so badly that they looked like blurred photographs. I tied his bow tie, adjusting the silk knot until it was perfectly symmetrical, a tight noose of elegance around his neck. He stood before the full-length mirror, swaying slightly, looking like a wax figure that had been left too close to a fire, handsome from a distance, but melting and distorted up close. "I look terrible," he rasped, staring at the dark circles under his eyes and the hollows of his cheeks. "They'll know. Everyone will know." I stood behind him, smoothing the shoulders of his tuxedo jacket, my hands resting heavily on him to keep him upright. "You look distinguished," I lied, meeting his eyes in the reflection with a gaze that was hard and flat. "You look like a man who has worked himself to the bone for his patients. They will call it dedication. Marcus, they will call it sacrifice." I reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, folding it into a crisp triangle and tucking it back in. "Besides," I added, turning him away from the mirror so he couldn't see the doubt in my own eyes, "once I give you the medicine, you won't care how you look. You'll feel like a king." The mention of the medicine straightened his spine instantly, a Pavlovian response to the promise of relief. "Is it time?" he asked, licking his dry lips. "Not yet," I said, checking the clock. "First, I have to get ready. You sit here and wait. Don't touch anything." I left him in the bedroom and went to my own dressing room, closing the door and locking it, creating a barrier between his need and my transformation. For years, Marcus had dictated my wardrobe, filling my closet with muted pastels, beige cardigans, and modest black dresses that allowed me to fade into the background. The perfect, invisible accessory to his brilliance. But tonight, I was not going to be invisible. I reached into the back of the closet, behind the garment bag containing my wedding dress, and pulled out the dress I had bought 3 months ago in a fit of secret rebellion. It was red, not a polite burgundy or a soft maroon, but a violent, screaming scarlet, the color of an open wound, the color of danger, the color of a stop sign that has been ignored. I slipped it on, the silk sliding over my skin like cool water, and zipped it up. It fit like a second skin, hugging my curves and exposing my shoulders, a stark departure from the shapeless sacks he preferred. I applied my lipstick, a matching shade of blood red, and looked in the mirror. The woman staring back was not Sarah the nurse, or Sarah the victim. She was something new, something dangerous. I put on my diamond earrings, the ones he had given me as an apology after he broke my wrist accidentally on our 5th anniversary, and they glittered coldly, like shards of ice. I was wearing his guilt as jewelry and my anger as a gown. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of my own expensive perfume, and opened the door. When I walked back into the bedroom, Marcus was still sitting on the edge of the bed where I had left him, his head in his hands. But he looked up at the sound of my heels clicking on the hardwood. His eyes widened, and for a moment, the fog of withdrawal lifted, replaced by a shock of genuine disapproval. "What? What are you wearing?" he stammered, blinking as if the color hurt his eyes. "You can't wear that. It's too loud. It's inappropriate." He tried to muster his usual authority, the voice that used to make me change my outfit 3 times before we left the house. But it lacked teeth. I walked over to the dresser and picked up the small travel case containing his medicine, not breaking eye contact. "It's a Gala." "Marcus," I said, my voice cool and dismissive. "Red is festive. Besides, you're in no position to critique my fashion choices." I turned to face him, letting the dress swirl around my legs, challenging him to stop me. He opened his mouth to argue, to tell me to change into the black dress he liked. But a wave of nausea hit him, and he clutched his stomach, the fight draining out of him instantly. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. He needed me more than he needed to control me. He slumped back, defeated by the silk and the sickness. "Fine," he muttered, looking away. "Just hurry up, please." I opened the travel case and took out a syringe, pre-filled with a clear liquid that looked exactly like the salvation he craved. It wasn't the heavy cocktail I had planned for later. It was a simple saline solution mixed with a high dose of B12 and a mild stimulant, just enough to wake him up and stop the shaking for an hour. But not enough to touch the deep, gnawing hunger of his addiction. I flicked the barrel of the syringe, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "This is just a booster," I explained, walking toward him as he rolled up his sleeve with pathetic eagerness. "It will get you to the car and through the red carpet. The real dose, the heavy one. I'll give you that right before you go on stage. We need it to peak at the exact moment you accept the award." He nodded frantically, not caring about the logistics, only wanting the needle. I wiped his arm, found a vein that hadn't collapsed yet, and injected the fluid. He gasped, his eyes rolling back in his head as the placebo effect and the stimulant hit his system. "Oh God," he breathed, the tension in his shoulders releasing slightly. "Thank you. Thank you, Sarah." I capped the needle and put it back in the case, looking down at him with a mix of disgust and pity. "Don't thank me yet," I whispered, helping him stand up. He was steadier now, the vibration in his hands dampening to a manageable tremble. "Come on, Dr. Thorne. Your public awaits." I took his arm, my red dress brushing against his black tuxedo. a splash of blood on a funeral suit, and we walked toward the door, leaving the safety of the house for the spotlight that would destroy him. The interior of the limousine was a hermetically sealed capsule of black leather and silence, insulated from the noise of the city, but thick with the smell of Marcus's fear. He sat on the opposite bench, his legs twitching in a restless rhythm that vibrated through the chassis of the car, and he kept checking his reflection in the darkened window as if expecting his face to slide off. The mild stimulant I had given him was fighting a losing battle against the withdrawal, keeping his eyes open but doing nothing to quell the storm raging in his nervous system. And I watched him unravel with the dispassionate interest of a spectator at a gladiator match. "It's wearing off," he whispered, his voice cracking, and he rubbed his hands together, the friction creating a dry, rasping sound that grated on my nerves. "You said it would last an hour. It's barely been 30 minutes. I smoothed the silk of my red dress, the fabric cool and slippery under my fingertips, and looked at him with a practiced expression of sympathy. "Metabolism varies, Marcus," I said softly, leaning forward to adjust his bow tie, which had gone crooked from his constant fidgeting. "Your body is burning through it because of the stress. You just need to hold on a little longer." He looked at me, his eyes wide and wet, pleading for a salvation that I was withholding. "I can't do the carpet," he panicked, looking out at the passing streetlights which smeared into long, blurry streaks of light. "My legs, they feel like jelly. I'm going to fall." "You won't fall," I assured him, my voice firm and commanding, the voice of the person who now held the leash. "I will be right there. I will hold you up, just like I always have." I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, silver flask, unscrewing the cap and handing it to him. It contained nothing but ice water and a few drops of peppermint oil. But to him, it was a lifeline. "Sip this," I instructed. "It will settle your stomach." He drank greedily, some of the water spilling down his chin and onto his pristine white shirt, leaving a small, transparent spot that would vanish under the heat of the lights. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, a gesture so unrefined for a man of his stature, and leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. The car slowed down, turning onto the avenue that led to the convention center, and even through the soundproof glass, we could hear the dull roar of the crowd. It was the sound of adoration, the sound he used to feed on. But tonight it sounded like a beast waiting to devour him. "We're here," I announced, and I saw a tremor run through his entire body, a physical rejection of the reality awaiting him. "Remember, Marcus," I whispered, moving to sit beside him, my red dress pooling around us like spilled wine. "Smile. Wave. Don't speak unless you have to. Let me do the talking." He nodded, gripping my hand so hard his knuckles turned white, seeking strength from the very person he had spent years trying to break. The driver opened the door, and the world exploded into a chaotic symphony of noise and light, the flashbulbs popping like distant gunfire in a war zone. We stepped out onto the red carpet, the plush fabric soft beneath my heels, and the air was instantly sucked out of the space by the sheer intensity of the attention. Marcus stumbled, his foot catching on the edge of the carpet, and for a heart-stopping second, he tipped forward, gravity threatening to claim him before I was ready. I caught his arm, my grip like a steel clamp hidden beneath the velvet touch of a loving wife, and hoisted him upright with a strength he didn't know I possessed. "Steady," I hissed through a frozen smile, waving to the photographers who were screaming his name. "Don't let them see you falter." The lights were blinding, white-hot bursts that seared the retina. And I knew that for Marcus, whose brain was already swimming in a chemical soup of withdrawal and antipsychotics, this must be torture. He blinked rapidly, his eyes watering, and he shielded his face slightly. A gesture that looked like modesty, but was actually pain. "It's too bright," he mumbled, leaning heavily against me, his weight dead and oppressive. "I can't see. Sarah, I can't see." I guided him forward, whispering directions into his ear like a pilot navigating a plane through a storm. "Step left. Smile right. Keep moving. You're doing great, darling." To the cameras, we were the picture of a power couple, the brilliant neurosurgeon and his supportive, stunning wife in red. But up close, we were a tragedy in motion. A man crumbling into dust, and the woman holding the dustpan. A reporter from the medical journal thrust a microphone into his face, her smile predatory and bright. "Dr. Thorne, Dr. Thorne." A moment for a quote on tonight's honor. Marcus opened his mouth, but his jaw locked, a spasm of anxiety seizing his vocal cords, and he just stared at her with the vacant, terrified look of a deer in headlights. The silence stretched for a second too long, threatening to become awkward, threatening to reveal the cracks in the porcelain. I stepped in smoothly, placing a protective hand on his chest, feeling the frantic, bird-like thumping of his heart beneath the tuxedo. "We are so thrilled," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the din, confident and charming. "Marcus is saving his voice for his acceptance speech. He's been working tirelessly on a new paper, and he's a bit under the weather. But he wouldn't miss this for the world." The reporter nodded, charmed by my intervention, and scribbled something on her pad. "And you look lovely, Mrs. Thorne," she added, eyeing my dress. "A bold choice." I smiled, a sharp, dangerous curve of red lips. "Thank you. Tonight is a celebration of life and blood, isn't it?" Marcus flinched at the word blood, but the reporter just laughed, thinking it was a witty remark. We moved on, leaving the question hanging in the air, and I felt Marcus sag against me, his energy completely spent by that single, silent interaction. "Get me inside," he groaned. "Please. I need the medicine." We finally reached the sanctuary of the green room, a quiet, dimly lit space reserved for the VIP guests, stocked with champagne and plush sofas. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, cutting off the noise of the gala, Marcus collapsed onto a velvet settee, tearing at his bow tie as if it were strangling him. He was gasping for air, his face slick with sweat that had finally broken through the layer of powder I had applied. "I can't do it," he sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "I can't go up there. My hands? Look at my hands." He held them up, and they were vibrating so violently that they looked like they were phasing out of reality. This was the hands of a surgeon, the hands that held lives in the balance, now reduced to useless, trembling claws. "You promised," he wept, looking up at me with the pathetic desperation of a child. "You said you had the heavy dose, the one that would make me fly." I looked down at him, standing tall in my red dress, feeling like a goddess of vengeance looking down at a mortal sinner. "I did promise," I said calmly, walking over to the small table where I had placed my clutch. "And I always keep my promises. Marcus, unlike you." I opened the bag and took out the travel case again, the small click of the latch sounding loud in the quiet room. He stopped crying instantly, his eyes fixing on the case with a terrifying hunger. I prepared the syringe with deliberate slowness, letting the tension build until it was a physical weight in the room. This was the cocktail I had spent weeks researching, a precise mixture of a high-dose opioid to give him the initial rush he craved, combined with a potent vasodilator and a delayed-release sedative. It wouldn't kill him, death was too easy, but it would cause a massive drop in blood pressure and a loss of motor control exactly when his adrenaline peaked on stage. "This is it," I whispered, holding the needle up to the light, checking for air bubbles. The savior's dose. Marcus rolled up his sleeve, not caring about the bruising from the earlier injection, presenting his arm like an offering. Do it, he begged. Please. Sarah, I'll do anything. Just make it stop. I sat beside him, my thigh brushing against his leg, and I leaned in close, my lips almost touching his ear. This will make you feel invincible. Marcus, I lied, sliding the needle into his vein. You will walk out there, and you will feel like a god. And then, you will rest. I pushed the plunger down, watching the clear liquid enter his body, watching the immediate, chemical relief wash over his face. His eyes rolled back, a moan of pure pleasure escaping his lips, and his body went slack against the sofa. Oh God, he whispered, slurring slightly. That's it. That's the stuff. I capped the needle and put it back in my bag, my hands steady and cold. Relax now, I said, stroking his hair, feeling the sweat cooling on his forehead. Let it soak in. You have 10 minutes before they call your name. He nodded dreamily. A dopey smile plastered on his face, the terror of the last few hours washed away by the artificial flood of dopamine. He looked peaceful, almost human. But I knew it was just the calm before the catastrophe. I stood up and walked to the mirror, checking my makeup, ensuring that not a single hair was out of place. I looked at my reflection, at the woman in red who had just administered a career-ending sentence. And I didn't see a monster. I saw a surgeon excising a tumor. Sarah. Marcus called out, his voice thick and heavy. Yeah, I replied, not turning around. You're a good wife, he mumbled, his eyes half closed. I'm sorry about the dog. The apology was meaningless. A drug-induced sentiment that had no roots in his soul. But it was fitting that it was the last coherent thing he would say to me as a respected man. I know. Marcus, I said, turning off the lights in the room so he could rest in the dark. I know. The stage manager knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps that signaled the end of the waiting game. Dr. Thorne, 5 minutes. I opened the door, flashing a dazzling smile at the young man with the headset. He's ready, I said, stepping aside to reveal Marcus, who was slowly standing up, buttoning his jacket with newfound chemical confidence. Showtime. The double doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a heavy, ceremonial whoosh, releasing a blast of refrigerated air scented with expensive lilies, roasted duck, and the collective ambition of the city's elite. To Marcus, who was currently riding the crest of a synthetic opioid wave. The room didn't look like a banquet hall. It looked like Olympus, a glittering cloud of crystal chandeliers and diamonds where he belonged by divine right. He stepped across the threshold, his gait loose and fluid, the stiffness in his joints replaced by a rubbery, disconnected sensation that made him feel as if he were walking on the moon. The applause started as a ripple near the entrance and quickly swelled into a roaring tide. A wall of sound that crashed against us, physically vibrating in the floorboards. I walked half a step behind him, the dutiful shadow in the blood-red dress, my hand hovering near the small of his back, not to support him, but to feel the moment his muscles would begin to fail. He waved to the crowd, his smile wide and unnatural, his eyes glassy and fixed on a point somewhere above the audience's heads because the drugs had dilated his pupils so much that the lights were actually blinding him. He leaned toward me, his breath smelling faintly of the peppermint oil I had given him to mask the rot inside, and whispered, "They love me. Sarah, look at them." I looked out at the sea of tuxedos and gowns, seeing not adoration, but a pack of wolves waiting for the alpha to stumble. Yes, They do, I replied, my voice a cool breeze against his fevered skin. So don't disappoint them. We navigated the maze of round tables, moving toward the stage like a bride and groom marching toward an altar of sacrifice. Stopping occasionally so Marcus could shake hands with the hospital board members. I watched these interactions with the clinical detachment of a bomb disposal expert, counting the seconds of delay in his responses, noticing the way his hand lingered a fraction too long in theirs, his grip sweaty and slack. The potent vasodilator in the cocktail was beginning to do its work, widening his blood vessels and causing his blood pressure to plummet, stealing the oxygen from his brain just as he needed it most. He laughed at a joke made by the chief of surgery, but the laugh was too loud. A braying, discordant sound that made a few heads turn with furrowed brows. "You're doing great," I murmured, steering him away before he could say something incoherent. "Just keep moving. The podium is right there." He stumbled slightly on a discarded napkin, his equilibrium compromised by the sedative that was slowly shutting down his cerebellum. But he corrected himself with a jerky, puppet-like movement. He looked at me, confusion flickering behind the chemical haze in his eyes. "The floor." He slurred slightly. "It feels slanted." I squeezed his arm, my nails digging into the expensive fabric of his jacket. "It's just the spotlight. Darling, keep your eyes on the prize." When we reached the steps of the stage, the master of ceremonies announced his name, the syllables booming through the surround sound speakers like the voice of God. And now, the recipient of the Golden Scalpel Award for excellence in neurosurgery, Dr. Marcus Thorne. The applause reached a fever pitch, a deafening ovation that covered the sound of Marcus's heavy, labored breathing. He looked at the stairs as if they were a mountain range, his depth perception flattened by the drugs, making the 3 simple steps look like a vertical cliff. I placed my hand on his elbow, giving him the propulsion he needed, effectively pushing him out of the nest and into the free fall. "Go on," I whispered, releasing him. "This is your moment." He ascended the stairs, each step a triumph of will over biology, and walked toward the podium where the trophy waited, gleaming under the harsh stage lights. I stayed in the wings, hidden in the shadows of the velvet curtains, the red silk of my dress blending into the darkness, watching the tragedy unfold from the best seat in the house. He reached the podium and gripped the sides of it with white-knuckled desperation, using the wood to hold himself upright as the room began to spin in earnest. He looked out at the audience, but I knew he couldn't see them. The combination of the glare and the hypotension would be reducing his vision to a narrowing tunnel of gray static. He leaned into the microphone, the feedback whining briefly before settling into a heavy, expectant silence. The room waited for the brilliant speech, the witty anecdotes, the humble bragging that Marcus was famous for. Instead, they got a long, wet pause as he tried to unstick his tongue from the roof of his mouth. The cottonmouth side effect of the cocktail-making speech physically difficult. He began, his voice booming too loudly. Startling himself, he flinched, losing his train of thought, and giggled a high, erratic sound that had no place in a formal ceremony. A murmur of unease rippled through the front row, the sound of uncomfortable fabric shifting on chairs. Marcus wiped sweat from his eyes, smearing his makeup, and squinted at the teleprompter. But the words were just dancing ants on a screen. "I want to thank." He tried again, but the words slurred together, turning thank into something that sounded like tank. He swayed dangerously to the left, and a collective gasp went through the room. Inside his body, the war was over. The drugs had won. His brain was starving for blood. His inner ear was sending chaotic signals. And his stomach, irritated by the chemical assault, was preparing to revolt. He looked toward the wings, searching for me, his eyes wide with the realization that he was dying in plain sight. "Sarah," he whimpered into the live mic, his voice small and terrified. "Help." The collapse was not cinematic. It was grotesque and humiliatingly human. His knees simply gave way, folding inward as if the strings holding him up had been cut. And he slid down the side of the podium, his chin hitting the wood with a sickening thud. The microphone, tilted downward by his fall, picked up every sound, the tearing of his breath, the rustle of his clothes, and then the undeniable, wet sound of him retching. He vomited bile and expensive champagne onto the stage floor, the liquid splashing onto his tuxedo shirt, staining the pristine white with the yellow of sickness. The crowd was frozen in horror, a tableau of shocked faces and covered mouths, witnessing the god of surgery reduced to a convulsing mess in his own filth. He tried to crawl, his hands slipping in the mess, looking for purchase, looking for dignity, but finding neither. I'm okay," he mumbled into the floorboards, his voice amplified to the back of the room, broadcasting his delusion. "Just tired." He tried to stand, but his legs were useless, twitching with the residual effects of the muscle relaxants I had fed him earlier. He looked like a broken insect, spinning in circles, trapped in the harsh cone of the spotlight that refused to turn off. This was the cue. I stepped out from the shadows, my heels clicking rhythmically on the stage floor. A slow, deliberate cadence that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. I didn't run. I walked with the grace of a grieving widow approaching a coffin. I knelt beside him, ignoring the mess, and placed a hand on his heaving back. The audience saw a devoted wife rushing to her husband's aid, a saint in a red dress comforting the fallen hero. But Marcus saw the truth. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and tearing, bile dripping from his chin, and he saw the cold, hard satisfaction in my eyes. I leaned in close, covering his microphone with my hand so only he could hear me, and whispered the final line of the play. "You didn't trip, Marcus. I pushed you." I stood up then, turning to the horrified audience, my face a mask of tragic concern. "Please," I shouted, my voice cracking perfectly. "Cut the feed, he's having a stroke. Somebody call an ambulance." The chaos erupted then. Medics rushing the stage, people shouting, cameras flashing to capture the disaster. I stepped back, letting them swarm him, watching as they loaded him onto a stretcher, strapping him down like a madman. He stared at me as they wheeled him away, a look of pure, unadulterated horror on his face. He knew. He finally knew. And as the double doors swallowed him up, I smoothed my red dress, wiped a speck of his vomit from my shoe, and walked off the stage, leaving the golden trophy behind. The VIP suite on the 12th floor of St. Jude's Hospital was a masterpiece of sterile luxury, smelling of expensive lilies and the sharp, chemical tang of high-grade disinfectant, a scent that Marcus had once associated with power but which now smelled entirely of captivity. I stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline that glittered indifferently in the distance, my red dress replaced by a modest gray cardigan and slacks, the uniform of the grieving, devoted wife. Behind me, the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor provided a steady, electronic soundtrack to the silence, a metronome counting down the seconds of Marcus's new life as an invalid. He had been unconscious for 12 hours, a medically induced coma to manage the severe hypotension and the subsequent seizure he had suffered on stage. But the doctors, his former colleagues, men who used to tremble when he walked into a room, assured me he would wake up soon. They spoke to me in hushed, reverent tones, careful not to disturb the tragic hero who had worked himself to the point of a stroke for the sake of medicine. That was the narrative I had carefully constructed in the ambulance. Weeping softly into a paramedic's shoulder while slipping the empty vial of opioids I had planted into Marcus's pocket. Ensuring that the toxicology report would find exactly what I wanted it to find: a man broken by stress and self-medication. Not a victim of poisoning. I turned from the window and walked to the bedside. Looking down at the man who had once been a god, he looked small beneath the starch-stiff sheets. His skin, the color of old parchment. His mouth slightly open. A plastic tube taped to his cheek. His hands. The famous golden hands that had repaired spines and removed tumors, were now strapped to the bed rails with soft restraints to prevent him from pulling out his IVs during the convulsions. They looked like dead spiders, curled and useless. The eyelids fluttered first. A rapid, REM-like movement that signaled the brain was clawing its way back to the surface of consciousness, trying to reassemble the shattered fragments of reality. I stepped closer, leaning over the rail, my shadow falling across his face like a closing door. Marcus opened his eyes, and for a moment, they were blank, devoid of recognition. Two pools of muddy brown confusion staring up at the acoustic ceiling tiles. Then, memory rushed in: the gala, the lights, the nausea. My whisper and the confusion hardened into a sharp, crystalline terror. He tried to sit up, his body jerking against the restraints. But his muscles were flaccid, unresponsive, betraying him just as they had on stage. He tried to speak, to shout my name, to scream for the police. But all that came out was a wet, guttural gargle, a sound that lacked consonants or structure. Ah. He choked, his eyes widening in panic as he realized his tongue felt like a piece of foreign meat in his mouth. I reached out and placed a cool hand on his forehead, a gesture that looked maternal to anyone watching on the security camera, but felt like a brand of ownership to him. "Shh," I whispered, my voice smooth and calm. "Don't try to speak. Marcus, you've had a significant neurological event. It's called Broca's aphasia. You can understand me, but you can't form the words. It's a side effect of the stroke." I used the medical terminology deliberately, wielding his own language against him, defining his reality before he could even process it. He shook his head violently, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes, his gaze darting to the restraints, begging to be released. I didn't unlock them. Instead, I picked up a damp cloth and gently wiped the spittle from his chin, establishing the new dynamic: he was the mess, and I was the cleaner. Dr. Reynolds, the chief of neurology and Marcus's rival for the past 10 years, bustled into the room with a clipboard, looking grave but secretly pleased. An expression I recognized because I had seen Marcus wear it 1,000 times when delivering bad news. "Ah, he's awake," Reynolds said, checking the monitors but avoiding eye contact with the patient, treating Marcus like a piece of furniture. "Sarah, how is he responding?" I turned to Reynolds, my face a mask of tragic resilience. "He's confused. Doctor," he tried to speak, but I let the sentence trail off, allowing the implication to hang in the air. Reynolds nodded sagely, tapping his pen against the chart. "Expected. The hypoxic event during the seizure caused damage to the left frontal lobe. We found high levels of opioids in his system. Sarah, it seems he overdosed." He said the word delicately, as if it were a dirty secret we were all agreeing to keep. I looked down at the floor, squeezing a tear out of my eye. He was in so much pain. I lied, my voice trembling. His back? The tremors. He was trying to hide it so he could keep working. He sacrificed himself for this hospital. Reynolds sighed, buying the story completely, because it was easier to believe in a fallen hero than a domestic monster. "We'll do everything we can," he promised, finally looking at Marcus with a mixture of pity and professional dismissal. "But the motor damage, his hands. It's unlikely he'll ever operate again." Marcus let out a high-pitched whine, a sound of pure despair. As the verdict was delivered, Reynolds patted his shoulder awkwardly. "Rest now, Marcus. You're in good hands." He left the room, leaving us alone in the silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the debris of Marcus's life. I waited until the heavy door clicked shut, sealing us in. And then I pulled the visitor's chair close to the bed, sitting down so my face was level with his. I looked into his eyes, stripping away the mask of the grieving wife to reveal the cold, hard surface of the judge underneath. "You heard him," I said softly, my voice devoid of pity. "You're finished, Marcus. The golden scalpel is gone. The reputation is tarnished. But I saved the last shred of it for you." He stared at me, his breathing rapid and shallow, hate burning in his eyes alongside the fear. He pulled at the restraints again, the leather creaking against the metal rails. "I told them it was stress," I continued, smoothing the sheet over his chest. "I told them you were a martyr who worked too hard. If you stay quiet, if you play the part of the tragic invalid, you get to keep your dignity. You get to be the retired legend." I leaned in closer, my lips inches from his ear. "But if you try to write a note, if you try to signal someone, if you try to tell them what I did, I will release the photos, the ones of my bruises, the ones of the dog, and I will show them the logs of you stealing drugs from the pharmacy. You won't just be a sick man, you'll be a monster. You'll go from this bed to a prison cell. Do you understand?" Marcus stopped struggling. He looked at the ceiling, then at me, calculating the odds with his damaged brain, and realized he had zero leverage. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracking through the stubble on his cheek, and nodded imperceptibly. It was the surrender I had been waiting for. I reached for the pitcher of ice water on the bedside table and poured a small plastic cup, the sound of the liquid splashing loud in the quiet room. "You're thirsty," I stated, not asking. I spooned a small chip of ice and held it to his lips. He hesitated, his pride warring with his biological need. But his mouth was dry as dust, and he opened it. I fed him the ice, watching him suck on it desperately, reduced to the dependency of an infant. "See," I whispered, stroking his hair, "I'm going to take such good care of you, just like you took care of me." The double meaning hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't just a patient, he was my project now. I had taken his voice, his hands, and his freedom, not with a gun, but with patience and his own vices. I looked at the monitor, watching his heart rate stabilize, a slow, rhythmic thumping that synced with the clock on the wall. "We're going to go home soon," I promised him. "I've already had the contractors install a ramp, and I moved your things to the downstairs guest room. You won't need the master bedroom anymore." The guest room was small, dark, and had bars on the windows technically for security. But we both knew what they were for. He looked at me with a profound, hollow sadness, realizing that the hospital was just a way station between one prison and another. The sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the room that looked like the bars of a cage. I didn't turn on the lights. I preferred the twilight, the gray area where morality blurred and justice took on a different shape. I sat there for hours, holding his hand not out of love, but to feel the tremor that was still there, the permanent reminder of my work. He fell asleep eventually, exhausted by the trauma and the lingering sedatives. But even in sleep, his face was twisted in a grimace of anxiety. I opened my purse and took out the old stethoscope, the one I had taken from his pocket before the ambulance arrived. I put the earpieces in and placed the diaphragm over his chest, listening to the sound of his heart. Lub-dub. Lub-dub. It was a strong heart. Physically, it would keep beating for a long time. Years. Maybe? Years of silence. Years of me feeding him, washing him, wheeling him into the garden to look at the flowers he could never touch. I smiled in the semi-darkness. It wasn't a happy ending. It was a just one. Primum non nocere. I whispered into the silence. First, do no harm. But sometimes, harm is the only cure for a disease that has no name. The seasons had changed outside the windows of the guest room, shifting from the brutal, gray chill of late winter into the tentative, pale green of early spring. But inside the house, time had stopped, frozen in a perpetual loop of routine and silence. I sat in the wicker chair by the window, the morning sun warming my back, holding a stack of heavy, cream-colored envelopes that had arrived in the mail yesterday. Marcus sat opposite me in his customized wheelchair, his head propped up by a memory foam neck pillow, his hands resting on his lap like two dead birds that had fallen from a nest. He was looking at the birds outside. Or perhaps he was looking at the reflection of his own hollowed-out face in the glass. It was hard to tell with the aphasia. Listen to this one, Marcus, I said, my voice bright and cheerful, the way one speaks to a slow child or a beloved pet. I slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener, the tearing sound sharp in the quiet room. Dear Dr. Bacter, Thorn, I am praying for your recovery every day. You saved my husband's life 3 years ago, and we know you have the strength to overcome this tragedy. The world needs your golden hands. It's signed by Mrs. Porter, Higgins from Ohio. I lowered the letter and looked at him. He didn't blink. A small muscle in his jaw twitched, a microscopic spasm of rage or perhaps shame. But his expression remained trapped behind the mask of his paralysis. Isn't that sweet? I asked, folding the letter and placing it on the stack with the dozens of others. They think you're fighting a battle, Marcus. They don't know the war is already over, and you surrendered unconditionally. I stood up and walked over to the small kitchenette I had installed in the corner of the room, effectively turning his world into a self-contained studio apartment where he could exist without ever intruding on the rest of my house. I took a jar of baby food from the cabinet, pureed peas and carrots, a vibrant, unappetizing orange-green sludge, and popped the lid. The sound was a dull thwack that signaled lunch, and I saw Marcus's throat bob as he swallowed dryly, anticipating the humiliation. Open up, I said softly, approaching him with a rubber-coated spoon, the kind used for infants to protect their gums. He kept his lips pressed together for a defiant second, a flicker of the old tyrant trying to break through the wreckage of his nervous system. But I just waited. I didn't force him. I didn't pry his jaw open. I simply held the spoon there, waiting him out, knowing that hunger and the biological imperative to survive would eventually override his pride. It took 10 seconds. He opened his mouth, his eyes squeezing shut in defeat, and I slid the spoon in. He swallowed with difficulty. A wet, clicking sound coming from his throat, and a trickle of orange puree escaped the corner of his mouth. I wiped it away with a cloth diaper I kept on his shoulder, my touch gentle, efficient, and utterly dehumanizing. Good boy, I whispered. You have to eat your vegetables if you want to get strong enough to sit in the garden. After lunch, I wheeled him out to the backyard, maneuvering the chair over the threshold with practiced ease. The air was crisp, smelling of wet earth and impending rain, a scent of renewal that contrasted sharply with the stagnation of Marcus's life. I pushed him along the stone path, the wheels crunching softly on the gravel, until we reached the far corner of the yard. under the old oak tree. This was where I had buried Buster 3 months ago. Hacking at the frozen ground in the middle of the night while Marcus slept his drug-induced sleep. Now, the earth was disturbed again. But not for a grave. I had planted a bed of bleeding hearts Lamprocapnos spectabilis, their pink and white flowers drooping like heavy tears. Right over the spot where the dog lay. "Look how well they're growing," I said, locking the brakes on his wheelchair so he was forced to face the flowers. I used a very special fertilizer. Organic matter really helps the soil. I stood behind him, resting my hands on his shoulders, feeling the tension in his trapezius muscles. He knew. He looked at the flowers, and I could feel the vibration of a whimper building in his chest, trapped behind the dam of his damaged vocal cords. He tried to turn his head away, to look at the fence, at the sky, anywhere but at the beautiful, blooming evidence of his cruelty. But his neck muscles were too weak to fight the headrest. He was forced to stare at the beauty that had grown from his violence. "Buster is part of the garden now," I murmured, leaning down so my cheek brushed against his ear. "And in a way, you are too. We're all just part of the ecosystem. Marcus, predator and prey, soil and flower." I left him there for an hour to contemplate nature while I went inside to practice the piano. I hadn't played in 10 years because Marcus had said the noise distracted him from his research. But now, the house was mine. I sat at the Steinway in the living room, the keys cool and inviting under my fingers, and I began to play a nocturne by Chopin. The notes floated through the open French doors, drifting out into the garden where Marcus sat trapped in his chair. I played with passion, with volume, letting the music fill the empty spaces that used to be occupied by his ego. I wondered if he could hear it. If the melody brought back memories of the days when he pretended to love me, or if it just sounded like another form of torture. I imagined him out there, the wind ruffling his thinning hair, unable to cover his ears, forced to listen to the soundtrack of my liberation. It was a cruel concert, but he had bought the ticket a long time ago. When I finished, I felt a lightness in my chest, a release of tension that I hadn't felt since before I said I do. I walked back out to the garden, my step light and bouncy. "Did you like the music?" I asked, unlocking his brakes. He didn't respond, his head lolling slightly to the side, drool glistening on his chin. He looked exhausted, worn down by the simple act of existing. "Let's get you cleaned up," I said brightly. "It's almost time for your sponge bath." The evening ritual was the most intimate and the most terrifying part of our new life. I wheeled him into the bathroom, the same bathroom where I had shaved him on the night of the gala, and the memory hung between us like steam. I undressed him, stripping away the sweatpants and the loose t-shirt, leaving him naked and vulnerable on the shower chair. His body, once fit and gym-toned, had begun to soften, the muscles atrophying from disuse, the skin becoming pale and doughy. I washed him with a lavender-scented soap, scrubbing his back, his legs, his feet, treating him with the detached thoroughness of a nurse in a geriatric ward. I avoided his eyes, not out of shame, but because I knew looking at him gave him a sense of connection he didn't deserve. To me, he was a task, a series of biological functions to be managed. "Dr. Reynolds called today," I said conversationally as I dried his toes. "He asked if we wanted to try a new speech therapy program. Experimental stuff." Marcus's head jerked up, hope flaring in his eyes for a brief, desperate second. I paused, holding the towel suspended in the air. "I told him no," I said flatly. "I told him you were too tired. I told him we accepted your condition." The hope died instantly, replaced by a black, crushing despair. "We don't need false hope, do we, Marcus?" I asked, tossing the towel into the hamper. We have everything we need right here. Quiet, peace, each other. I dressed him in fresh pajamas. Soft silk ones that cost more than my first car. Because I believed in treating my prisoners well. I wheeled him back to the guest room and used the hydraulic lift to transfer him into the hospital bed. He settled into the mattress with a sigh, his body relieved to be horizontal. I adjusted the blankets, tucking him in tightly, effectively swaddling him so he couldn't move. I walked over to the bookshelf and pulled down a leather-bound book, his own published dissertation on the ethics of neurosurgery. I sat in the chair under the reading lamp. Story time, I announced. I began to read his own words back to him. His pompous, self-aggrandizing theories about the sanctity of life and the moral obligation of the doctor. I read with a mocking cadence, emphasizing the parts where he talked about compassion and integrity. He closed his eyes, tears leaking out silently, unable to bear the irony of hearing his past self condemn his present reality. I read for 20 minutes, until his breathing evened out, signaling that exhaustion had finally overcome his misery. I closed the book with a snap. "You were a very good writer, Marcus," I said. "It's a shame you didn't believe a word of it." I stood up and walked to the door, my hand hovering over the light switch. The room was shadowed, the only light coming from the street lamp outside the barred window, casting long, cage-like stripes across his bed. He opened his eyes one last time, looking at me with a mixture of fear and profound, ancient weariness. He wasn't fighting anymore. The drug I had given him at the Gala had done its job on his body. But the silence I had given him since then had broken his soul. He was exactly where I needed him to be, alive enough to suffer, but too broken to hurt anyone ever again. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old stethoscope, draping it around my neck. It was a habit now, a symbol of who was in charge. "Good night, Marcus," I whispered. "Sleep well. I'll be here when you wake up. I'll always be here." I flipped the switch, plunging the room into darkness. I stepped out into the hallway and closed the door, turning the key in the lock with a satisfying click. The sound echoed through the silent house, the final note of a long, dark symphony. I walked toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of wine. The house was quiet. The justice was complete. And for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't heavy. It was weightless.